She walked into the room, and everyone went silent. Not the good kind of silent. The kind where people stop breathing, where hands reach for weapons, where eyes go wide with pure, unfiltered terror. She was an alien princess. And every single person in that hall, every soldier, every diplomat, every powerful leader from a dozen different worlds, wanted her gone. Some wanted her dead, but one man stood there and saw something completely different. He saw the truth. And that truth? It was about to change the entire universe. Here is what nobody talks about. The most powerful beings are almost never the ones everyone cheers for. Sometimes the most powerful being in the room is the one everyone is trying to destroy. Sometimes the one labeled as a monster is actually the only one carrying the future on her shoulders. This is that story. And before this video ends, 3 things are going to shock you completely. First, you are going to find out why an entire galaxy feared one young woman so deeply that they built weapons specifically designed to kill her. Second, you are going to discover what one ordinary human man saw that every king, general, and emperor completely missed. Third, you are going to learn what her true power actually was. And trust me, it was not what anyone expected. Not even close. This is not just a love story. This is not just a sci-fi adventure. This is a story about what happens when the whole universe gets something terribly catastrophically wrong. Let me show you exactly how this happened. The planet Valoria was not a place most humans had ever heard of. It sat at the far edge of the Cassian cluster, a region of space so remote that even the most advanced star maps sometimes left it blank. It was not a rich planet. It was not a famous planet. But it was an old one. Older than most civilizations currently living in the galaxy could even comprehend. The Valorians had been around for thousands of years before humans ever figured out how to build a fire. They were tall, elegant. Their skin carried a deep crimson tone that shifted slightly depending on their emotional state. Darker when calm, almost glowing when they felt strong emotion. Their eyes were a piercing, luminous blue that seemed to catch light from sources that simply were not there. And they moved with a kind of quiet grace that made everyone around them feel slightly clumsy in comparison. For most of their history, the Valorians were respected across the galaxy. They were scholars, healers, diplomats. They had resolved more interplanetary conflicts than any other civilization in recorded history. They were known as the quiet architects, the ones who built peace where others built walls. But that was before the war. And it was before her. Her name was Seraphil. She was the last daughter of the Valorian royal bloodline, born during a celestial event that happened once every 10,000 years, a triple eclipse, where 3 of Valoria's moons aligned perfectly and blocked the light of their sun for exactly 7 minutes. The Valorians called it the Veil of the Deep. Ancient texts described it as a moment when the boundary between the physical universe and something much older, much larger, grew thin. Seraphil was born in those 7 minutes of darkness. And from the very first moment she opened her eyes, something was different about her. Her mother saw it immediately. The royal healers saw it. Even the stone-faced palace guards, men and women who had spent decades training their emotions into nothing, shifted uncomfortably when they looked at the newborn princess. Her eyes were not the standard luminous blue of her people. They were a deep, swirling violet, a color no Valorian had ever been born with in all of recorded history. The scholars were called in. The ancient texts were pulled from sealed vaults. Debate raged for weeks. Some said it was a blessing. The text spoke of a rare Valorian gift called the Veyrath, an ability so extraordinary, so deeply connected to the fabric of reality itself, that it only appeared once in thousands of generations. The Veyrath was described as the power to perceive truth in its absolute, unfiltered form. Not just truth in the sense of knowing when someone was lying. Something far deeper. The ability to see the true nature of everything. People, places, decisions, consequences, futures not yet written. Others said it was a curse. Because the same texts that described the Veyrath as a gift also warned about what it did to the one who carried it. Every emotion felt 100 times stronger. Every secret seen whether the carrier wanted to see it or not. Every future possibility flooding the mind in waves that never stopped. The last known carrier of the Vayreth had gone mad by the age of 23, had torn apart her own palace walls screaming about things that had not happened yet, had eventually walked into the Valorian Ocean and never come back. The king, Seraphel's father, looked at his infant daughter with love in his eyes, but also with something that looked very much like grief. He knew what was coming. He just did not know how terrible it would truly be. Seraphel grew up mostly alone, not because she was unlucky, not because she was unkind. She was actually one of the most naturally warm and curious children the palace staff had ever encountered. She asked questions constantly. She laughed easily. She was fascinated by everything from the smallest insects in the palace garden to the vast star charts that covered the walls of the royal library. But the Vayreth made normal relationships almost impossible. When she was 4 years old, she told her favorite nursemaid that the woman's husband was going to betray her. She described it in calm, simple detail. The other woman he had met, the lies he was telling, the moment the nursemaid would find out. She did not say it to be cruel. She said it because to her it was simply something she could see, as clearly as she could see the color of the walls around her. The nursemaid was gone by the next morning. When she was 7, she stood in the middle of a diplomatic banquet her father was hosting for a neighboring planetary system and announced, in front of everyone, that the lead ambassador was planning to have her father assassinated before the season was over. She pointed right at him. Her violet eyes locked on his and did not blink. The ambassador denied it furiously. Her father was mortified. The entire diplomatic relationship nearly collapsed on the spot. 3 months later, they found the poison hidden in the ambassador's personal quarters, designed specifically for the Valorian royal bloodline. Her father never doubted her again. But everyone else did. The older she grew, the more her reputation spread. And not in the way anyone would have wanted. Word traveled across trading routes and diplomatic channels the way word always traveled. Twisted, exaggerated, stripped of context. The princess who could read minds. The princess who destroyed relationships. The princess who saw things no one should be able to see. By the time Seraphel was 16, the stories had grown into something barely recognizable. Other planetary systems were telling their people that the Valorian princess was a psychic weapon, that she could break alliances just by being in the room, that she drove people to madness, that looking into her violet eyes was enough to shatter a person's mind. Delegations began refusing to visit Valoria if she would be present. Trade agreements stalled because other governments did not want their officials exposed to her. One minor planetary system, a small but strategically important world called Dethera, formally requested that the Valorian king either confine his daughter or send her off-world permanently. They called her a threat to galactic stability. Her father refused, quietly, firmly, but the request had been made, and that changed everything, because other governments were watching. And when powerful governments start agreeing with each other, even quietly, even unofficially, things begin to move in directions that cannot be easily stopped. Seraphel was 17 when she first understood that she was not just feared. She was a target. She was sitting in the royal library late at night, surrounded by star charts she loved and books she had read a dozen times, when the Vayreth showed her something she had never seen before, a vision so clear, so detailed, so utterly certain that she sat completely still for nearly an hour afterward. She saw a council, many faces, many worlds, all agreeing on one thing. She needed to be eliminated, not imprisoned, not exiled, gone. And the timeline she saw was not distant. It was not some vague, far-off possibility. It was 3 years away. She closed the book she had been reading very carefully, set it back on the shelf exactly where it belonged, walked back to her room, and lay in the dark for a very long time. She was not afraid. That was the strange part. She was not afraid at all. Because somewhere in that vision, at the very edge of it, barely visible through all the darkness and the threat and the converging forces moving against her, she had seen one other thing. A face. A human face. And somehow, without understanding how or why, she knew that face was the reason she was going to survive. His name was Caleb Rourke. If you were building a list of people most likely to change the fate of an alien princess and alter the course of galactic history, Caleb would not have made the list. Not even close. He was 26 years old. Originally from a small town in rural Oregon, USA, the kind of place where the biggest local news was usually about the high school football team, or whether the old diner on Main Street was going to close down. He had grown up with a single mother who worked 2 jobs, a younger sister he was fiercely protective of, and an old telescope he had saved up for 3 years to buy. He had always looked up. Even when everything around him was pointing down, Caleb Rourke looked up. He had joined the United Earth Coalition fleet not because he was particularly military-minded, but because it was the only realistic path he could find that led to space. He was not the top of his training class. He was not the most physically impressive recruit, but his evaluation scores showed something that his instructors kept circling back to in their reports. Caleb had an unusual ability to read people, not in any mystical or supernatural sense, just a deeply human, deeply practical talent for noticing what others missed. The slight tension in someone's voice when they were lying, the micro-expression that crossed a face for less than a second before the mask went back up, the detail in a room that everyone else walked past. His commanding officer, a sharp-edged woman named Captain Hara Osai, had written in one evaluation that Caleb Rourke was the most situationally aware junior officer I have encountered in 14 years of active service. She had also written that he was occasionally too empathetic for standard tactical decision-making, which in military language meant he cared too much about the people on the other side of the conflict. Caleb had read that evaluation and quietly agreed with both assessments. He had been assigned to the USE's Diplomatic Liaison Division 18 months before the events of this story, not because he had asked for it. Because someone higher up the chain had noticed his evaluations and decided his particular skill set was more valuable in a room full of alien diplomats than in a fighter cockpit. He had been to 11 different worlds in those 18 months. He had sat in rooms where 40 different species negotiated trade routes and territorial boundaries and resource agreements. He had watched deals fall apart over misunderstandings so small that a child could have explained them. He had also watched deals get made that looked impossible right up until the moment they were not. He was good at this work. He just was not entirely sure he loved it. Until the assignment came through that changed everything. The briefing was delivered on a Tuesday morning, Earth Standard Time. Caleb was sitting in the UX regional office on the orbital station above Mars when his superior officer, a tired-looking man named Director Fennick, dropped a datapad on his desk with an expression that suggested the man genuinely did not want to be delivering this particular assignment. Valoria. The mission was officially described as a routine diplomatic observation. The UK had been invited, somewhat reluctantly, according to the notes, to send a representative to an upcoming galactic summit being hosted on the neutral station Aethon Prime. The summit was significant. Representatives from over 30 planetary systems would be present. The agenda included several major territorial resolutions and at least 2 long-standing trade disputes, but buried in the lower section of the briefing, in language that was carefully neutral and professionally sanitized, was the real reason Director Fennick looked uncomfortable. The Valorian royal family would be attending, including the princess. And several of the attending governments had formally flagged concerns about her presence. There were protective protocols in place. There were containment measures proposed. There were quiet, official discussions about whether the princess should be permitted in the main summit chamber at all, or whether she should be restricted to separate, isolated quarters for the duration. The UK, as a newer and smaller player in galactic politics, had been asked to provide an observer, someone who would watch, report, and not cause any additional diplomatic complications. Caleb read the briefing 3 times. Then he looked up at Director Fennick and asked the question that had been sitting in his mind since the second paragraph. Has anyone actually talked to her? Fennick blinked. The princess? Yeah. Has any of these 30-plus governments actually sat down and had a real conversation with her? Not a formal diplomatic exchange. Not a protocol meeting. An actual conversation? Fennick's expression shifted into something that was difficult to categorize. Not quite irritation, not quite discomfort. Something in between, with a thin layer of something that might have been embarrassment underneath. That's not really the purpose of your assignment, Rourke. I know, Caleb said. I'm just asking. Fennick did not answer. Which was, Caleb thought, a very clear answer. He packed his kit that same afternoon. The journey to Aethon Prime took 9 days. Caleb spent most of it reading everything the UX database had on Valoria, on the Valorian royal family, and on Seraphil specifically. There was a lot of material. Most of it was other governments' intelligence assessments, diplomatic incident reports, and what appeared to be an increasingly alarmed series of intergovernmental memos about the princess's destabilizing influence. But Caleb had spent 18 months reading diplomatic documents. He had learned to look at what was not being said just as carefully as what was. And what was not being said in any of these hundreds of pages of official concern was anything that actually described what Seraphil had done wrong. She had told the truth. Repeatedly. Accurately. In situations where the truth was deeply inconvenient for people who held a great deal of power. That was apparently enough. He found one personal account, buried in an appendix of a report nobody had clearly read very carefully. A former Valorian Palace staff member, interviewed by a UX cultural researcher 6 years ago. The staff member described Seraphil as the most genuinely kind young woman I have ever encountered. Said she remembered every person's name. Asked about their families. Noticed when someone was having a difficult day and found quiet ways to help. The researcher had noted this account with a single line, anecdotal. Insufficient to alter threat assessment. Caleb stared at that line for a long time. Then he set down the data pad and looked out the viewport at the stars moving past. He was not yet sure what he was walking into. He did not have a plan. He was not carrying any particular heroic intention. He was just a young man from Oregon who was very good at noticing things others missed. But something in his chest, some quiet but persistent instinct that had served him well for 26 years, was telling him clearly, and without any uncertainty at all, that every single document he had just read was missing the most important thing. And he was about to find out what that was. Aethon Prime was exactly the kind of place that made Caleb feel very small. It was not a planet. It was a constructed station, massive beyond any easy comprehension. Built over the course of 300 years by a cooperative of 12 civilizations as a permanently neutral meeting ground. It was roughly the size of Earth's moon. Its exterior alone featured enough docking ports to accommodate fleets from 40 different systems simultaneously. Its interior was a layered, cathedral-like network of halls, chambers, gardens, and residential sectors, each one designed to accommodate the specific environmental needs of different species. Caleb arrived on the 6th day before the summit was scheduled to begin. The station was already filling up. He walked through corridors where beings of dozens of different shapes and sizes moved with the particular purposeful energy of people who believed the business they were conducting was very important. He was assigned quarters in a mid-level sector, modest by the station's standards but comfortable enough. He reported to the UX observation team, a group of 4 people who were already looking slightly overwhelmed by the scale of what they were observing. He attended the first 2 rounds of pre-summit briefings. He shook hands, or performed the appropriate species-specific greeting, with representatives he had met before and some he had not. He was professional. He was attentive. He was everything his assignment required. And on the morning of the 4th day, walking back from an early briefing through a less trafficked corridor in the station's cultural exchange wing, he turned a corner and nearly walked directly into Seraphil. She was alone. That was the first thing that surprised him. Every other dignitary of her status moved through the station with at least a small security detail. She had none. She was standing by a large curved viewport, looking out at the star field beyond the station, wearing simple dark clothing rather than the elaborate royal garments she apparently wore at official functions. Her violet eyes were focused somewhere beyond the glass, and she had not heard him coming. For exactly 1 second, Caleb experienced the same involuntary physical reaction that apparently everyone else experienced when they encountered the Valorian princess, without preparation. A tightening in the chest, a sudden heightened awareness, something that his nervous system interpreted as warning. He recognized it immediately for what it was. Not danger, not threat. Pure, overwhelming presence. Then she turned and looked at him, and the reaction shifted into something else entirely. Because her expression, when she saw him, was not what he expected at all. She looked surprised. And underneath the surprise, clearly visible to anyone paying close enough attention, was something that looked remarkably like relief. You are the human, she said. Her voice was calm and precise. Her command of the standard diplomatic language flawless. From the coalition. Caleb Rourke, he said. UEC diplomatic liaison. Sorry, I wasn't watching where I was going. She studied him for a moment. The violet eyes were up close, genuinely extraordinary. Not unsettling in the way the reports had suggested, but deeply, unusually still. Like looking at very deep water on a windless day. You read the briefing documents, she said. It was not a question. All of them, he confirmed. And you came anyway. That's generally what an assignment means, yes. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile, but close. Most of the representatives who read those documents have been avoiding this corridor since they arrived, she said. They use the longer route around the north section to avoid the possibility of encountering me without preparation. Caleb glanced back the way he had come. That explains why it was so quiet over here. She turned back to the viewport. You are not afraid of me. I don't have any reason to be, he said simply. She was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice was slightly different. Quieter. More careful. Everyone has a reason, she said. They find one eventually. He did not answer immediately. He thought about the staff member's account buried in the appendix, the researcher's dismissive single line, the hundreds of pages of official concern that never once described anything she had actually done wrong. I read an interview, he said finally. A former palace staff member. She said you were the kindest person she had ever met. Seraphel went very still. The researcher marked it anecdotal, Caleb continued. Said it was insufficient to alter the threat assessment. He paused. I thought that was a strange call. She did not respond for a long moment. When she turned back to look at him, her expression was composed. Professionally, carefully composed. But her eyes were doing something that her expression was working very hard to hide. Why are you telling me that? She asked. Because it seemed like something you should know, he said. That someone wrote it down, that it existed in the record, even if nobody was paying attention to it. She looked at him steadily. The stillness of those violet eyes was not cold. It was something else. Something that took him a moment to identify correctly. It was the look of someone who had spent a very long time being careful, who had learned to build distance between herself and everything that might matter, because mattering meant hurting, and hurting had become a thing she could not afford. You see things, she said quietly. Not accusing, just observing. Not the way you do, he said. Nothing like that. I just pay attention. Most people pay attention to what they expect to see. Yeah, he said. I noticed that too. They stood in silence for a moment. Outside the viewport, the stars were steady and enormous, and indifferent to all of it. The summit begins in 3 days, she said eventually. I know. There are 12 governments attending who have formally recommended my removal or containment. She said it with a neutrality that was almost more disturbing than anger would have been. There are 3 more who have made informal recommendations through back channels. I know that too. And you still introduced yourself. He looked at her. You're a person. You were standing in a corridor. It seemed like the right thing to do. She studied him for another long moment. Then she turned back to the viewport. 3 days, she said again, almost to herself. He was not entirely sure what she meant by that. But as he walked away and turned back into the main corridor, the quiet instinct in his chest that had been speaking to him since Mars was now speaking considerably louder. Something was coming. Something that none of the 30-plus governments, with all their briefing documents and threat assessments and protective protocols, had actually prepared for. And it was going to start right here. The summit began with all the formal ceremony that events of this scale demanded. Great halls filled with delegations. Banners and insignia from 32 planetary systems arranged in careful negotiated order. Opening speeches delivered in multiple languages, translated in real time through the station's communication systems. The particular kind of practiced public diplomacy that everyone present understood was performance first, and substance second. Caleb sat in the observer section with his UEC colleagues and watched. He was good at watching. Seraphel was seated in the Valorian delegation's designated area, a position that had clearly been calculated to keep her visible but peripheral. She was dressed in full royal regalia today. Deep crimson robes with gold detailing. The jeweled crown he had seen described in the briefing documents. She sat with perfect stillness, her expression composed into the neutral, formal blankness of someone who had learned that every expression she made was analyzed and catalogued by people looking for evidence of threat. But Caleb was watching the room, not just her, and what he saw in the room was illuminating. Every few minutes, from different delegations, eyes would drift toward Seraphiel. Just briefly. Just for a second. And in that second, before the professional mask snapped back into place, he caught the same thing over and over again. Not hatred. Not the aggressive, motivated fear that actually drives people to violence. Discomfort. The particular discomfort of people who knew, somewhere underneath all their official positions and carefully written documents, that they were doing something they could not entirely justify. The discomfort of people who had convinced themselves of a story and were now sitting in the same room as the person the story was about. He had seen that expression before. In much smaller, much more human contexts. The coworker who had helped push someone out of a job and could not quite meet that person's eyes at the company meeting afterward. The childhood friend who had joined in when others were cruel and spent years afterward being aggressively, almost desperately, normal around the person they had hurt. Guilt dressed up as caution. That was what he was seeing. On the second day of the summit, the moment that everyone had apparently been quietly dreading arrived. A routine procedural item became, in the space of about 40 minutes, the thing that the summit would ultimately be remembered for. A delegate from the Detheran system, the same system that had formally requested Seraphiel's confinement years earlier, stood up and submitted a formal resolution. It was elegantly worded, carefully constructed. In the language of diplomatic process, it was technically sound. It called for the creation of a new intergovernmental protocol regarding individuals possessing involuntary psychic or perceptual capabilities that may compromise the integrity of diplomatic processes. It proposed mandatory screening, restriction of access to certain classified sessions, and the establishment of a monitoring framework. It named no one specifically. It did not need to. Every single person in that hall knew exactly who it was about. The room went very quiet in a very specific way. The kind of quiet that happens when something has been said that cannot be unsaid, and everyone present is recalibrating how to respond. Caleb watched Seraphiel. She had not moved. Her expression had not changed. But her hands, resting on the table in front of her, had shifted very slightly. One small movement. She had placed them flat against the surface, fingers spread, in what he recognized as a deliberate, conscious grounding gesture. She was holding herself still. He felt something sharp move through his chest. The vote was scheduled for the following morning, which meant tonight, informal conversations would happen. Positions would be quietly consolidated. The resolution had been submitted by one delegation, but you did not submit something like that at a summit this size without knowing you had the numbers to pass it. This was not an opening move. This was a closing one. He left the hall before the session formally ended, and spent 3 hours going through every piece of documentation he could access on the resolution, the Detheran delegation, and the voting history of the attending governments on related issues. What he found was not surprising, exactly, but it was clarifying. Of the 32 attending governments, 19 had historical records of voting in alignment with Dethra on matters involving Valoria. Not because of any dramatic conflict or formal alliance, just the slow, accumulated weight of shared perspective. The way that when enough powerful voices repeat the same story, the story starts to feel like fact. 3 governments were genuinely undecided. Their records showed consistent independence on procedural matters. They voted based on argument, not alignment. The remaining 10, including the Valorian delegation, would obviously vote against. 19-13 was a comfortable passage margin. Unless the 3 undecided governments moved. He found Seraphiel in the same corridor as before. He was not entirely surprised. He suspected she had come here deliberately, perhaps knowing, in the way she apparently knew things, that he would come too. She was not looking at the stars this time. She was sitting on a low bench against the wall, and she was very tired. Not physically. Something deeper than physical. You saw what happened today, she said when he sat down across from her. Yes. You know what the vote tomorrow will mean. I know what it's supposed to mean, he said. I'm not entirely sure it has to mean that. She looked at him with something that was almost patience, the patience of someone who had seen too many things to afford easy hope. There are 19 votes committed against me, she said. Committed, he said. Not certain. There's a difference. The 3 independent governments will not risk their relationships with 19 others for an abstention. Probably not for an abstention, no. He agreed. But an abstention isn't what I'm thinking about. She was quiet. The Catherine delegation, he said. They're one of the 3 independents. Ambassador Voss has been in this game for 30 years. I have watched her in 3 separate sessions over the past 2 days, and she has not once looked at you the way the others do. She is not afraid of you. She is watching the process. She cares about whether the process is correct. Seraphile's violet eyes were fixed on him. The Miran Confederacy delegate is the same, he continued. Different reasons. Their system has historical sensitivity about precedents involving involuntary capability restrictions. Their own history has a chapter that looks a lot like what that resolution is trying to do. You read their history. I read everything I can get access to. He leaned forward slightly. Seraphile, the resolution passes because everyone in that room has accepted the version of you built from second-hand reports and accumulated discomfort. None of them have actually heard from you. Not in any real way. Not in the way that changes things. She was very still. What if that changed? He said. Tonight. Before the vote. She looked at him for a long, measured moment. They will hear what I say and they will still be afraid, she said quietly. Maybe, he said. But right now they're afraid of a story. What if they heard the truth? The violet eyes held his, and in them, for the first time since he had met her, he saw something that had not been there before. Not hope exactly, but the beginning of it. The informal gathering was not on any official schedule. Caleb arranged it in 3 hours, working through every legitimate connection and professional relationship he had built in 18 months of diplomatic liaison work. He called in every small favor. He sent every carefully worded message. He was honest about what he was asking for and what it was not. It was not a formal session. Not a recorded proceeding. Not anything that would appear in the official summit documentation. Just a conversation. He framed it around the independent delegation's own stated principles. Ambassador Voss of Catherine had given a public address 18 months ago about the importance of direct engagement over document-based assessment in sensitive diplomatic situations. Caleb had read that address 3 times in the past 6 hours. He quoted it back to her in his message. She responded within 20 minutes. The Miran Confederacy delegate, a reserved and precise being named Counselor Dre, required a more detailed conversation. Caleb spent 40 minutes on a direct communication channel, answering every question with complete transparency. When Dre asked why a junior UK liaison was the one making this request rather than a senior Valorian diplomatic representative, Caleb said simply, because the senior Valorian representatives have learned to expect rejection. I haven't yet. There was a pause on the channel. Then Dre said he would attend. The 3rd independent delegation was smaller, a single world called Arun, represented by an elderly delegate named Pasha, who had been attending these summits for longer than Caleb had been alive. Caleb visited her in person, knocked on the door of her quarters and waited. When she opened the door and looked at him with the particular expression of someone who had seen many young people with many urgent requests, he said, I just want to make sure the vote tomorrow is based on something real. She studied him for a moment. Room 7C, she said. 2 hours. He had 3. He went back to Seraphile and told her. Her reaction was not what he expected. She did not look relieved. She did not look grateful, exactly. She looked at him with an expression he could not immediately read, and then she said something that stayed with him for a very long time afterward. You did this not because you think it will work, she said. You did it because you think it is right. He considered that. Both, maybe. No, she said quietly. Not both. You are not certain it will work. You told me 3 hours ago you were not certain. But you did it anyway. She paused. Do you understand how rare that is? He did not have a good answer for that. So, he just told her the room number and the time, and she nodded, and they went separately. Room 7C was a small conference space in the station's mid-level diplomatic wing. Neutral, plain, nothing like the grand halls of the formal summit. Ambassador Voss arrived exactly on time, as Caleb had suspected she would. Counselor Dre arrived 2 minutes later. Pasha came last, moving slowly but with the particular unhurried certainty of someone who always arrived exactly when they intended to. Serafil was already there when they came in. She was seated at the simple table without her crown, without the full ceremonial regalia. She was wearing the same dark, simple clothing she had been wearing in the corridor the first time Caleb had seen her. She looked younger without the royal layers, and more real. Caleb did not speak. He sat to one side, as far from the center as he could get, and made himself as invisible as possible. This was not his conversation to lead. Voss spoke first. The ambassador was a precise and careful communicator. She said clearly that she had come to listen, that she was making no commitments, and that her attendance did not represent a position change. She said it in a way that was firm without being unkind. Serafil nodded. I would not ask for anything else. Then she spoke. And Caleb, who had read hundreds of pages of documents about this woman, understood within the first 5 minutes that none of them had captured anything close to the reality of who she was. She did not defend herself. She did not argue against the resolution or attack the delegation supporting it. She did not perform humility or make strategic appeals to sympathy. She simply told the truth. She described what the Vayreth was, not in the sensationalized terms of intelligence reports, but in the quiet, matter-of-fact way of someone describing a part of their own life that was sometimes extraordinary and frequently exhausting. She described what it felt like to see things before they happened and have no choice but to carry that knowledge. She described the isolation of knowing that every relationship you formed was shaped by what you already knew about it. She told them about the nursemaid she had been 4 years old, and how she had not understood yet that truth, delivered without context, without relationship, without preparation, was not the same as kindness. She said she had spent years learning that difference. She told them about the ambassador her father had hosted, the one with the poison. She did not tell it as a story of her own power. She told it as a story of a 7-year-old child who had wanted her father to be safe, and did not know how to say that in any way other than the most direct one available. Counselor Dre asked questions. Careful, precise, genuinely curious questions. Serafil answered every one without deflection. At one point, Pasha, who had been sitting with her hands folded and her eyes quiet and attentive throughout, leaned forward and asked something that none of the official documents had ever touched. Are you afraid? The old delegate asked. Not of the vote. Of what comes after, whatever it is. Are you afraid? Serafil was quiet for a moment. I know what is most likely to happen tomorrow, she said. The Vayreth does not leave room for comfortable uncertainty. She paused. But I have also learned that what I see is not always what must be. Possibilities shift. People make choices that the future does not expect. She looked at Caleb briefly. Just for a second. So yes, she said, I am afraid, but not of what happens to me. She looked back at the 3 delegates. I am afraid of what it means if this is the precedent that gets set. For anyone who is different in ways they did not choose. For anyone whose truth makes the people around them uncomfortable. She paused. That is the thing worth being afraid of. The room was quiet. Then Voss said, Thank you for coming. And nothing else. They filed out. Caleb could not read anything from their faces. He had spent 18 months learning to read diplomatic faces, and he genuinely could not tell. Serafil sat at the table after they left. She did not look at him. We tried, he said. Yes, she said. We did. The vote was in the morning. Neither of them slept. The morning of the vote arrived with the particular quiet of something enormous and irreversible drawing close. Caleb was in the observation section when the formal session opened. The hall was full. Every delegation present. The atmosphere was charged in a way that even the most professionally composed representatives could not entirely conceal. The Detheran delegate opened the formal proceedings with a brief restatement of the resolution's purpose. The language was careful and clean. From a purely technical standpoint, it was well constructed. Caleb had to give them that. Then the floor was opened for final statements before the vote. Several delegations spoke in support of the resolution. Their statements were measured. None of them were cruel. They spoke about process integrity, about the challenges of operating in environments where informational asymmetry existed, about the importance of consistent protocols across all sensitive diplomatic spaces. None of them mentioned Serafel by name. None of them had to. The Valorian delegation's senior diplomat offered a formal objection, covering the legal and procedural grounds. It was well argued. It was not going to be enough. Then the floor was quiet for a moment, and Ambassador Voss of Kethrin requested to speak. Caleb felt something shift in his chest. Voss stood with the calm, absolute economy of movement of someone who had done this for 3 decades. She did not use many words. She rarely did. From what Caleb had observed, she said that the Kethrin delegation had significant concerns about the resolution as currently written, not about its intention, but about its precedent. She cited 3 specific historical cases from galactic diplomatic history where similarly structured protocols had been applied with results that all parties later acknowledged as unjust. She said that Kethrin's position was that a matter of this weight, with precedent implications this broad, required significantly more deliberation before any vote could be considered appropriate. She moved for a 6-month postponement to allow for proper review. The room shifted. Councillor Dre immediately seconded the motion. And then Pasha, slowly and without any particular drama, raised her hand and seconded it also. What followed was not simple. Parliamentary process at a summit of this scale never was. The Detheran delegation objected. There were procedural arguments, counter-motions, the kind of detailed back and forth that people who had not spent time in these rooms found impossible to follow. But the numbers had shifted. A postponement motion required a simple majority. With the 3 independent delegations now actively moving it forward, the calculus had changed. Several smaller governments who had been quietly uncomfortable with the original resolution's speed, who had committed to Dethra's position, but had not been entirely at ease with it, found a procedural off-ramp that allowed them to step back without losing face. The postponement passed. Not unanimously. Not easily. But it passed. The resolution did not die. Everyone in the room understood it had not died. But it had been stopped. Given back to time and process and deliberation. And in galactic politics, time and process were sometimes the most powerful forces available. Caleb sat very still in the observation section. He did not look at the Valorian delegation's table, but from his peripheral vision, he could see that Serafel had not moved either. After the session formally closed, he walked out through the northern corridor, the longer route, the one all the delegates had been using to avoid accidentally encountering the princess. He did it not to avoid her, but because it was quieter, and he needed a moment. She found him anyway. She was waiting at the end of the corridor, standing by the same viewport where they had first spoken. The stars outside were the same. Everything else felt entirely different. "You knew," he said when he reached her. "You saw this happening." "I saw it as a possibility," she said. "Not a certainty. I told you. Possibilities shift. And last night? When you were talking to them?" She was quiet for a moment. "When I was talking to Pasha, I saw something change. A small thing. A decision she was forming. I watched it happen. And you still didn't know for certain." "No," she said. "I never know for certain. That is the part nobody understands. The Veyrath shows me possibilities, not guarantees. Every moment, every choice, every small human decision, it all shifts what comes next. I can see the landscape. I cannot make the terrain." He stood beside her and looked out at the stars. "So what happens now?" he asked. "The resolution will come back," she said. "Perhaps in 6 months. Perhaps in a different form. The fear does not disappear because a vote was postponed." "No," he agreed. "It doesn't. But it was not the vote that mattered most today," she said. He looked at her. 3 delegates walked into a room last night because one human man from Oregon asked them to, she said. They walked in ready to listen. That is not a small thing. She paused. The Veyrath has shown me futures for as long as I can remember. In most of them, this summit ends in a way that takes something from me that cannot be recovered. In the versions where it does not, she stopped. In those versions, she said quietly, there was always someone who saw past what everyone else chose to see. He held her gaze, those violet eyes, steady and deep and carrying more than anyone should have to carry. I just paid attention, he said. Yes, she said. You did. And that is the rarest thing there is. They stood together in the quiet corridor for a while. The summit would continue for 3 more days. There were still territorial resolutions to negotiate, trade agreements to finalize, the long and complicated business of civilization to work through. The resolution would come back, as she had said. The fear would not disappear. But something had changed. Not in the great sweeping way of legends and stories. Not in the way of battles won and evil defeated, and worlds saved in dramatic, conclusive moments. In the quiet, specific, deeply human way of 3 people choosing to walk into a room and listen. Of one conversation that shifted one decision that moved 3 votes that changed one outcome. The universe did not announce it. No one wrote a proclamation. The stars outside the viewport looked exactly the same as they had the day before. But Seraphil, the alien princess that an entire galaxy had feared, stood in a corridor on a neutral station at the edge of known space. And for the first time in as long as she could remember, the future she could see spreading out ahead of her did not look entirely like darkness. It had something in it that the Veyrath had not shown her in years. Light. Small, careful, uncertain light. But real. And beside her, the human man from Oregon who had simply decided to pay attention stood quietly, looking at the stars, understanding in his own wordless way that this was not an ending. It was the start of something the universe had not yet decided what to do with, and that, he thought, was just fine. Here is the thing that this story is really about. And it is not what you might think. It is not about a special power. It is not about an alien princess with extraordinary gifts. It is not even about forbidden love across the stars, though that thread is woven through every part of it. It is about what we do with the people who tell us the truth when the truth is inconvenient. Seraphil did not become a target because she was dangerous. She became a target because she was honest. Because her very existence made it impossible for powerful people to maintain comfortable lies. And when you make it impossible for powerful people to maintain comfortable lies, those people do not thank you for it. They build resolutions. They write threat assessments. They use the language of process and protocol and legitimate concern to do something that has a much simpler, much older name. They try to silence what makes them uncomfortable. And here is the unexpected part, the twist that the story has been building toward since the very first moment Caleb nearly walked into her in that corridor. The Veyrath, the gift that everyone feared, the ability that entire governments organized against, was never a weapon. It was never a threat. It was something so simple and so profound that the fear of it was almost embarrassing in hindsight. It was empathy taken to its absolute limit. The ability to feel what was true, to feel what others were feeling, to perceive consequence and connection, and the real weight of things that most people spend their entire lives avoiding. That was the power everyone feared. Not destruction, not manipulation, not anything remotely like a weapon. Pure, unfiltered truth, and the compassion to carry it. We began this story with a room full of people going silent, with hands reaching for weapons, with an entire galaxy deciding that one young woman was too dangerous to be free. We ended in a quiet corridor, with 2 people standing in starlight, and one future that just got slightly less dark. If this opened your eyes to what we call dangerous, to who we choose to fear, to what we miss when we stop paying attention, then hold that thought. Because the universe has more stories like this one. And they are all true in the ways that matter most. Before you go, Let's bring it all back together. Because this story had a lot moving through it, and there are a few things worth carrying with you. First, Seraphil was not feared because of what she did. She was feared because of what she saw. And that distinction matters enormously. The world, both human and otherwise, has a long and uncomfortable history of treating truth-tellers as threats, of building very official, very organized systems to manage the discomfort of people who simply cannot stop seeing what is actually there. That pattern is worth recognizing. Second, Caleb Rourke was not special in the way action heroes are special. He had no extraordinary power, no classified training, no secret weapon. He had attention. Genuine, patient, disciplined attention to what was actually in front of him, rather than what he had been told to see. That is available to every single person watching this video. That is a choice you make every day. Third, the 3 delegates who walked into room 7C did not save the day because they were saints or visionaries. They saved it because they were willing to listen before they voted. Just that. The willingness to hear something directly rather than through the filter of everyone else's fear. It is astonishing how rare that is and how much it changes. This story is fiction, but every truth in it is real. Now, if this video moved something in you, here is what I would love for you to do. Hit that subscribe button right now, because every week on this channel, we bring you stories exactly like this one, phi science fiction at its deepest, most human level. Stories about what humans are actually capable of when the universe underestimates us. Stories about power, truth, courage, and connection across impossible distances. You do not want to miss what is coming next. Hit the like button if Seraphil's story hit differently than you expected. It genuinely helps this channel reach people who need to find stories like this one. And you would be doing something real with a single click. And here is the one I really want from you. Drop a comment below and tell me this. Who in your life sees the truth the way Seraphil does? Or tell me, if you had the Veyrath, if you could see pure truth about everything around you, would you want it? Or would it be too much to carry? I want to know. Genuinely. The conversation in the comments on videos like this one is always the best part, and your answer might become part of the next story we tell together. If you want to go deeper, the next video is already waiting for you. It is another Nephi story, and it features a human who walks into a situation that every advanced civilization in the galaxy said was mathematically impossible to survive. The ending will ruin you in the best possible way. The link is on your screen right now. Trust me on this one. This is Nephi Sci-Fi. This is where humanity shows up for the universe. We will see you in the next one.